Matija Mužek, česãnъ or česãnъ, which of the four Proto-Slavic dialectal types of the rightwards accent shift does the Ozalj dialect belong to? К какому из четырех прославянских диалектных типов правостороннего дрейфа относится диалект города Озаль? Пожалуйста, please.
Здравствуйте, я тоже не говорю по-русски, so I will continue in English. And the answer to the question asked in the title is, I'm still not sure, because the data is very heterogeneous and somewhat ambiguous, but I will show it to you. And in the end, we may all arrive at the correct answer, if it is at all possible. And this study builds on Professor Dybo's paper, in which he identified a number of accentual isoglosses in Slovene and Kaikavian areas, which divide northern dialects from southern dialects. And these isoglosses have to do with the operation of what is now termed the rightwards accent shift, or the pravostoronny дрейф, which is found in the following grammatical categories, mostly in accent paradigm V. The exceptions are these genitive and locative dual forms of these accent paradigm C nouns. We will be able to ignore these last forms because they have been lost in the dialects we study. So basically, in each of these grammatical categories where initial accent, neo-acute, or a Balto-Slavic dominant circumflex is reconstructed on the stem, it can move onto the suffix depending on various conditions. And here we distinguish two types, Nikolaev's type 1 and type 3, both of which keep the original accent on the stem for long stems, but differ in their treatment of accent in short stems, because in type 1, the accent remains on the stem, and in type 3, it moves to the suffix. And the northern dialects belong to type 1, while the southern dialects belong to type 3. And we try to locate the border between the two types more precisely, namely, when it comes to the dialect of Ozalj. Let me show you the location of this dialect. Now, Professor Dybó, in his article, concluded that the dialect of Prigorje, or Prodindal, Prigorje is the wider area where this village of Prodindal is located, belongs to type 1, although it does not show the state of affairs expected of type 1 completely, but it can be concluded that it originally belonged to type 1 and later changed due to analogical developments. And on the other hand, the language of Juraj Križanić, a 17th century Croatian writer, who was from Ribnik, belongs to type 3. And the dialect of Ozalj is located right between Prodindal and Ribnik on the map and in the dialect continuum. It's a very interesting dialect with transitional features between Kaikavian and Čekavian. So it would be interesting to find out which type it belongs to in order to locate the border more precisely. And in order to help, we adduce data from other local dialects spoken in the area. So far, we researched the dialect of Tuscany and of Lazine, and we plan to research some more in order to help us arrive at our conclusion. And our focus is on the N participle, the past passive participle of A verbs, which have an infinitive stem in A. And the reconstruction that we start from is shown in this table. We conclude that this participle in essence only distinguishes a mobile paradigm or accent paradigm C and an immobile paradigm or accent paradigm A. There was apparently no accent paradigm B in Proto-Slavic for whatever reason. And this immobile paradigm usually correlates with similarly immobile paradigm of the present. For example, in the E verbs such as sălati, săliete, where there is the participle sălan, while, for example, this verb whose present belongs to the accent paradigm C has a mobile participle. But this correlation does not hold for other verb classes, where most of the data, such as the verb ležati or česati, kopati, and kupovati, in these classes, most data seems to point to immobile participles, even though at least the verbs like ležati actually have a mobile present. And we can't enter into details on how this came to be. Only we can say that this is the reconstruction that we start from. And we are the most interested in the immobile participles because this is where the rightwards accent shift is expected to operate. But we can't ignore the mobile ones because in the modern dialects, the two types often merge or influence each other at least. And this is the summary of our findings. We see that now, in cases where only accent on the suffix is found, the cell is in white. And where a suffix on the stem or on the prefix is found, the cell is in the yellow. And in the red are forms whose accent is a bit problematic and could point to a different reconstruction or simply to an analogy. And we see that no dialect actually is fully type 1 or type 3, always on the stem or always on the suffix. We see that Križanić language predominantly has accent on the suffix. However, in a very small class of verbs, like poslati, to send, there is free variation between accent on the suffix and accent on the prefix, which we can find in our data here. For example, we have the form poslana. This is actually a remnant of the nominative dual with accent on the prefix, but prislani and razaslani, where the accent is on the ending. And we conclude that this is secondary because it seems that in this particular class of verbs, which have a yer in the stem and the prefix, the two accent paradigms merged, and both original accent paradigm B verbs and accent paradigm C verbs show either accent fixed on the prefix or on the suffix. And On the other side of the continuum in Prodindol, we find accent on the stem in quite a number of verb categories. And we agree with Professor Dybo's conclusion that this should probably derive originally from accent on the stem in all cases. And the dialects of Ozalj, to which the dialect of Tuscany is nearly identical, they are essentially the same, and the dialect of Lazina are ambiguous. They are in between. They show more cases of possible original accent on the stem than Križanić, but not as much as Prodindol, and could in theory be derived both from type 1 and type 3. Here we try to show some possible ways by which accent on the suffix could arise from original accent on the stem, and vice versa. So there is always the possibility of direct analogy to forms without prefix. So if, for example, we originally have poslan, poslana, and poslano, the forms without prefix would be slan, slana, and slano. And there is always the possibility that by analogy through these forms without prefix, the forms with prefix change and shift their accent onto the suffix. This is probably what happened in Lazina. And if not, there is a possibility of secondary accentual mobility arising, which happens quite often in Western South Slavic dialects. And if taken well along, it could eventually lead to fixed accent on the suffix. This is a very likely hypothesis because different dialects and different words can stop at any of the points in this development. However, vice versa, it seems that this is not as easy. The only way we can imagine accent on the prefix arising from original type 3 accent only on the suffix is if original mobile and immobile accent paradigms merge, like we suppose happened in Križanić language. Otherwise, we can only count on some rather abstract analogies. So we tried to find forms which may speak for the original dialect types of the rightward accent shift, which might be archaisms because they are hard to explain as analogies. They are marked in yellow here. So first, in Ozalj, there's the verb setkati, to weave, which seems to lack accent on the suffix entirely. It can be accented on the prefix, like sitkan, sitkana, sitkano, or it can have a kind of mobile accent, sitkan, sitkana, sitkano. And we ask why there is no sitkan. It's plausibly an archaism. For example, Professor Dybó said the same about poslan, poslana, and poslani in Prodindol. However, it is not necessarily so. The verb tkati is quite similar phonetically with verb žgati, to set on fire, which was originally accent paradigm C, and often preserves the original mobile accent in Kaikavian. And there is evidence the two verbs influenced each other's accent in Ozalj. For example, originally the past active participle in L of tkati was tkal, but of žgati it was žgal. However, the two merged, and according to our sources on Ozalj, it can also be žgal now, not only žgal. So it is possible that the verb žgati, who originally was, for example, vužgan, set on fire, influenced tkati, so that the original sitkan completely disappeared. However, in other dialects, there are more certain archaisms. In Lazina, we find poštevan gospon, honored sir, but poštivana gospa, honored madam. And it is difficult to explain poštevan as anything but an archaism. There is just no other verb it could be analogical to, as in the original mobile verbs similar to this one, the original accent is not preserved. And we see a parallel in other Kaikavian dialects, for example, in Turopole, where this is the verb to buy, where the original accent on the stem, kupuvan, kupuvana, and kupuvano, was through secondary mobility modified. So it can also be kupuvan, kupuvana, kupuvano. And this is exactly what we seem to find in Lazina. So this is quite a plausible archaism, indicating that phonetically, in Lazina, we should expect accent on the stem according to type 1. And in Prodindol, of course, we have the already mentioned poslan, poslana, poslani, and other forms, that is kluvan, kluvana, kluvani, with accent on the stem in the singular, but on the suffix in the plural. This is somewhat ambiguous because either could be analogical, and there is motivation for both. This verb belongs to accent paradigm B. It's kluvati and ja klujem. So the singular accent could be modified by the present, while the plural accent could simply be influenced by the original mobile verbs like kovati, to forge, which also shift to ending accent. However, in Tuscany and Lazina, there is one verb of this class, original accent paradigm B verb, which actually seems to shift to long stems. The verb suvati, to push. It shifted, it stayed accent paradigm B. However, for some reason, its stem lengthened. So it's no longer sujem, but suvlem. And the participle is nasuvan. We think this analogy is somewhat more likely if originally it was nasuvan and not nasuvan. However, this form is again not as certain. And the most interesting is the accent of verbs like kopati, to dig. Now, originally, in these verbs present, we have contraction. So the original kopaete became kopate, with a circumflex accent on the ending. And interestingly, in Prodindol and Lazina, we find similar accent in the end participle as well. In Lazina, it is like that in all persons, like prekupan, prekupana, and prekupani. While in Prodindol, we find an anomalous accent on the stem in the masculine singular, which is likely an archaism. but this circumflex accent on the suffix in other persons. This is hard to explain phonetically, as it does not fit into the scenario that here we have original neo-acute or Balto-Slavic dominant circumflex on the root, and later it shifts to the right and probably does not become falling. So either this accent is a pure analogy to the present, or the accent of this participle has a different origin than originally supposed. The traditional theory by Stjepan Ivšić and I believe also Christian Stang was that here we find the same contraction as in present, although earlier and pan-Slavic. And if these forms are not analogical, they could, in essence, be archaisms showing the remnants of this contraction, which results in the circumflex accent. And as for the other cases of stem accent in the dialects of Ozalj and Lazina, the verbs like česati, where we can find česãnъ in free variation with česãnъ, we don't think accents like česãnъ necessarily indicate type 1, because one can easily imagine an analogy with the present. For example, in long verbs, we would have pisati, pisati, pišem, pisan. And in short verbs, if we originally had česati, češem, česãnъ, one can imagine česãnъ becoming česãnъ by some kind of analogy. Similar to what happens in the L participle feminine. Well, česãla often becomes česala by analogy to pisala, which is phonetic in Kaikavian. And as the data from the an participle is ambiguous, we also research other related forms. For example, the T participles. These in northern dialects, there is a distinction between accent paradigm A, for example, which is seen here in Prodindol, and accent paradigm C. So in Prodindol, preklet, prekleta is not the same as ožet, ožeta. The original immobile verb žeti keeps immobile accent in the participle, while the mobile verb kleti keeps the mobile accent in the participle. However, in southern dialects, for example in Križanić, the two merge and all participles shift to the mobile accent paradigm. So klet and žet in Križanić's language are the same, and the same is the case in Ozalj. We find žet, ižet, požet, like klet, preklet. And the same in other verb classes. However, this does not necessarily correlate with the accent of the N participle, because in Professor Dybo's article, we see that in Samobor, which is even further north than Prodindol, in the N participles we find the northern accent, but T participles still all shift to the mobile paradigm. So this would be an independent analogy. And we also...
Matija, imate možda 3 minute.
And this is probably, we also check the accent of the B2 verbs, which is probably our most important discovery. B2 verbs, which in northern dialects become accent paradigm B, and in southern accent paradigm C. we see that Križanić pretty clearly shows the southern state of affairs, and Prodindol pretty clearly the northern state of affairs. Now, in Ozalj, Tuscany, and Lazina, half of the verbs are be and half of the verbs are see. Interestingly, the same verbs in all three dialects, which are in the case of Ozalj and Lazina quite distinct, which shows this is probably not a recent innovation due to contact. And this probably proves that the Ozalj dialect is indeed an original transitional Kajkavian dialect and not some dialect mixtures as was supposed in Croatian dialectology. And what is also interesting is that the accent paradigm C of E verbs and accent paradigm B1 always give accent paradigm C and accent paradigms B respectively. So there was no massive shift or mixture between accent paradigms B and C. So what we see for B2 verbs seems to be original, probably old and not due to later shifts between the paradigms. And the accent seems to correlate with the accent of base nouns and adjectives for denominative verbs. We almost always see accent paradigm B from B nouns and accent paradigm C from C nouns and adjectives, but there are some exceptions where we see B noun but C verb. And of course, the causatives are all accent paradigm C. So our hypothesis is that the phonetic reflex of accent paradigm B2 was accent paradigm C, but very early a number of verbs shifted to accent paradigm B if their base nouns were also accent paradigm B. And as for the accent of the O stems case forms, to finish quickly, all data seems to point in Ozalj for original northern type accent on the stem, as cases of accent on the suffix when compared with Tuscany and Lazina are easily shown to be secondary. And our conclusion is, so in nouns, we see clear type 1 or northern accent in Ozalj, while in verbs, we are not sure yet, because the B2 verbs probably point to southern accent, while and participles might point to stem accent if Sutkan is not an analogy. Thank you. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо большое вам.